So nobody who knows me personally is going to be surprised that you're about to watch a 20-minute long video of me describing an answer to something that I saw in a meme on social media. And so let me show you this meme. Okay, so I woke up the other day, and we're getting into this video kind of fast, but if you're here and you haven't seen one of these data videos that I've done before, like, thanks for being here. Happy to have you. But let me show you this meme here. So this meme, it's one of those memes with a tweet, right, and somebody saying something, right? It says Deadliest Days in American History, and the highlight of this, they're highlighting that COVID-19 deaths are, that these last couple of days, like last Thursday, last Wednesday, these are some of the deadliest days in American history. And I'm not a huge history nerd, but I immediately thought back to like the Civil War, which had some massive casualty rates, like D-Day, and then not just that, but like the pandemic of 1918 and some, there's a couple other significant events in American history where, a lot of people died, and I feel like there was some oversight. So I kind of dove into a death statistic spiral, and I'm going after the answers to these, and I'm going to show you how I ended up going down this path, and you're going to kind of watch what I did to actually figure out, first off, what are the deadliest days in American history, right? And then we'll kind of split those like violent and non-violent days, right? Because I think this is important to know, because so not just was this meme made public, but the news media as well was also reporting on this. They said 4 of the deadliest days in U.S. history were reported last week, right? So, I had to find out if this is true or not. I went to Wikipedia. I looked up the Civil War. I immediately found out that the basic premise of it was incorrect statistically. That these, last week, this news story, right, this meme, they're not reflecting accurate statistics. And I think it's important that we understand that, because we're making some very important decisions right now, and we will in the near future, or just continuing on like throughout the course of humanity, based off of, right, like how many people die, why they die, and what sort of deaths we care about, and how we look at history, right? It forges how we move into the future, right? So let's get into actually like grabbing some of this data and working this up. So I went digging for death statistics, and one of the data sets that I was able to find was the death rate, and I could have taken that and I could have calculated that backwards to try and figure out the total number of deaths, but then I still wouldn't have had the origin of those deaths, or the days, or those specific periods of events, or anything like that. And the data set appeared to only go back to 1950, which is pretty far, right? And that's something to definitely, not something to shake a stick at. But I didn't actually end up going after that. I went looking for the CDC data. Problem with the CDC data was, to the surprise of not myself and probably nobody in the data mining community, or anybody who's gone after this data before. They have mortality reports and some CSVs, but not a lot of structured data relating to mortality statistics, or anything that could give you like most common cause, like rate, death count, population count, like all that side by side. So where I did end up finding it, wasn't actually kind of surprised about this, was actually USA Today actually had a story where they show the data on how many people died the year you were born. And they said, hey, here's the rates from 1933 to 2018. And they have the statistics from the CDC and the U.S. Census Bureau. So I think they might have got them from the Census Bureau, and I think that they fused them together, right? And I'll show you what the data looked like when I found it down here, right? So here's the data. It starts in 1934. We work our way up. And what it had in is death rate. It says per 1,000 people. Life expectancy, deaths, population, leading cause of death, second leading cause of death, third leading cause of death. And they had that all the way through 2018. So I figured I was going to go ahead and take this data and use it, right? So I went to go mine this data, but because this is not exactly laid out in table form, the best way to actually capture that was just a good old copy and paste. I'm going to show you right here. This is the data that I actually ended up with right here. And this is the structure that I was able to get to when I copied and pasted it. But when I brought it in, and ignore all this up here for a second, when I got it in, I had the year, and then I have what I want to be columns of data. When I say columns, I want this age-adjusted death rate to be here. I want the life expectancy to be here, the deaths total to be here, and so on and so forth, so that I can line that all up with the year. And I want some header columns, and then I want each year to be its own row. So to do that, we're going to have to transpose the data. So one thing that I had to do is when I went and copied and pasted from the source, let me just go back to that real quick. When I copied and pasted all the way down this page, one thing I ran into was there are like some pieces of text that were stuck because of ads, or like subtitles or subtext on images or videos, or like you may be interested in text. I think some of that got logged in there. So I had to go through the data and I had to actually clean it, check it for continuity before I ran processes on it, because what I'm able to do is able to actually take this data and then I can actually transpose this amount, these columns right here. So I can actually take right here this range and transpose it over to be in a row right next to where it needs to be. Let me show you that right here. I'm actually gonna copy that, paste it in there. Okay, right, so you can see now that when I transposed A4 all the way down, it should really be from A3 to A10, right? Now I have all of this data lined up in columns, and then later I can go through here and I can actually clean it so that I can get rid of some of these things that I don't want. So I knew that I had to get this data set clean so that I could have it all, so I could run this transpose all the way down the data set so that I can get everything in the column format that I want. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you how to take this transpose all the way down the data set. And this should work now. And we're going to find out if it does or if it doesn't. And what you're seeing here is actually pretty insane. It is showing you specifically a transposing of every single line. So it just looks like a massive mess of text. But what we're about to do is we're actually going to take this A column right here, and we're going to actually remove everything that's not a number from this right here. So when we go ahead and do that, then what's all going to be left is a nice clean year row. I'm going to highlight that for you real quick. Let me show you this. So for instance, we have 1934, adjusted death rate of this, life expectancy of this, total deaths of this. And then what I'm going to do, since all of that data is in those proper rows, or columns, excuse me, then what I can do is I can cut this text and then add some headers, and I should have a nice clean data set that we can run some stuff on. So the goal here is going to be to remove every single value that's not a year. And lucky for us, this data set has a defining feature of every single row that we don't want, which is this little bullet mark. If you can see, everything that's not a year has that. We actually have a lot of those inside of here. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to select column A, apply a filter, and then let's go in here to text filters. So we're going to filter out the text, and then we'll say, I'm just going to click this, and I'm actually going to get access to filters that I wasn't given to begin with inside of that initial filter. I want to say that I want everything that does not begin with this. And when I apply that filter, then we get something pretty cool. We actually get a line by line rundown of every single year and all the data points associated with it, and that's all we've got, right? So it actually looks like right here we have something odd going on right here. So that might be a row we need to take out, and that's exactly what I think that is. So let's look all the way down this line. And then here I think we do have something like that as well again. So we delete that row, but we see we have all the years are sequential. The only thing we have to question ourselves about is, are these pieces of data lining up with the correct years? And that's what we want to check. Now that we filtered, we want to check ourselves, spot check to make sure that our transpose put everything in the right place, and then all the data points are aligning. Even though we're restructuring it, we want to, at different phases, spot check this to make sure that we're working through this correct. Let's go ahead, and I'm just going to look up a random year. Let's go ahead and take 1964, and we'll look in the data set real quick. Run all the way down to 64. Let's see how many people died. We got 1.798 million. 1.798015. So that looks like that's correct. So let's go ahead and let's slide on down here. 1987, 2.123. Let's go ahead and run that. 1987, 2.1223. Yep. So it looks like we do have an accurate spot check on the data. I can tell just by looking through this that we've got it correct. So now what we need to do, now that we've got this year column situated and we have all of our data in these corresponding rows, what we're going to want to do is we're going to take this data, we're going to copy and paste all of its values over so that we don't have to worry about the filtering. And then what we're going to do is proceed to actually take this value, excuse me, the value that indicates what this cell actually means, which is age-adjusted death rate. We're going to put that at the head of the row, and then we're just going to put this number value in here. We're actually just going to put age-adjusted death rate per 100,000 people as the header. Same over here. We're going to put average life expectancy in years, and then we're just going to put a numerical value so that way we can actually run some algorithms on that. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to say deaths, and we're going to run just that as a straight number, as well as all of these other things. The only thing we won't be able to quantify via number is like these first and second and third leading causes of death, because those have a specific text element. So this one says like cancer, this one says pneumonia, right? Like I think the most recent largest cause was, that's always the second leading cause. The first leading cause is yeah, like heart disease, but sometimes it might be something different, right? So definitely there's a variable here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to chop all this up. We'll dig that down. So there's probably more eloquent ways to do this, but the way that I tackled this is I just went and I split everything into separate columns based off of differences in spaces, right? So I literally just went to text a column and just said, hey, I want to split up by space, and then also I used the semicolon so that way we could isolate this number, and then I just finished it. And I'll just say, yep, it's already some data there. And I moved all these other guys over here to the side, right? So this data is still fine. I did some inserts to get some bare columns in here. And so what I'm going to do is now I'm going to delete everything that isn't this row right here. And we'll just remember what that is, and deaths per 100,000 people. And we have our number here isolated now. So that's two columns down. And with this one, we can actually probably get away with doing something a little bit more eloquent. We can probably try to isolate only a number we just couldn't in that other one, because we had two different sets of numbers. So we had this number and then we had the 100,000 number. So and we're actually not going to do anything to filter these ones out, except for just split by the semicolon on any of these. So yeah, let's actually just go ahead and run through that real quick. So let's go ahead and I'll do an insert real quick and plug these columns in here. And I actually have a formula that I can use that will help me get rid of numbers. So I'm actually just going to shamelessly steal this because it's just available resource from the internet. I mean, nothing wrong with that, right? Let's go ahead and we'll put it to D2. And what this formula does, it just removes numbers. All right, so now you got 6.11, and that's not supposed to be what we do. We're going to want to get more eloquent than that. But because I'm not really sure what part of this I want to change, then we're probably just going to split by semicolon again. So let's go ahead and try that. And this is a good lesson in, sometimes getting the job done doesn't mean you have to do it in the most eloquent way. It just matters the result, right? So let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I need to get some more in there. That's kind of a pain with this. So I have that. That's more than enough. Let's go ahead and do text to columns. Do delimited. Space. Finish. Yep, that's fine. Average life expectancy in years, right? So alright, so let's burn that. Cool, let's see this. This one looks like it's going to be less of a hassle. Let's go ahead and get some copied cells in there. And let's take this, text to columns, delimited, finish. And we'll just remember that's the deaths. And this is the population. This one should be really easy. We can just actually do one split right here. Mark that as the population, and let's just move that over. And right at this point in time, I'm just going to go ahead and hit save because we've done a lot of manipulation on this data. So we should be pretty proud of the fact that if we didn't have a filter on, we've gone from this now all this junk right here all the way over to this. So we're headed in the right direction to having some data that we can actually run some numbers on and visualize out. So that's pretty significant. All right, so now we got leading cause of death right here. I'm just going to split by a semicolon because I want all of this other stuff. So let's go ahead, let's insert 2 because why not? And then text to columns. Yeah, we'll only have it be the semicolon. And mark this as a leading cause of death minus this and remove the formatting. I'll delete that because that's now trash, but this is exactly what we want. We don't need to change that anymore. All right, so let's see. Second leading cause of death. Let's go ahead and take that and we'll split text columns. Okay. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and move this over here. Third leading cause of death will actually be here because we're going to go ahead and split this again. All right, so let me go ahead and just for a final little something, like take that out. And let's go ahead and actually move that. Hi. All right, so now we got this. Now we have a clean data set. We have a column that says deaths per 100,000 people. We have a numerical value that fits that. And we can make trends off of this, and we can do different calculations. So this is going to be really good. Right? We got the first, second, and third leading cause of death. And we have it all the way back before World War II. Pretty wild. We got the year. So this is fantastic. So we're going to take this data, and we're now going to move into taking this data and running it through some cool visualization processes. So after I got all that clean data, I took it and I imported it into Tableau Public here on my desktop, and I just went to work on it. So I made a couple of different visualizations so I could kind of start to see some of these numbers that kind of help highlight these questions that we had initially in the first part of the video. So I want to go ahead and pause and just pull up this meme again so that I can show you guys this. So this is the meme, and it shows these counts that highlight, deadliest days, right? And so these counts are, from 2000 down to 2400 is apparently, making the top a couple of days. 9/11 is almost 3,000 people. The Civil War battle, 3,600, right? This one is kind of high, 8,000. But I want to start to show you, keep these numbers in mind, right? They sound like a lot for a day, right? But I'm going to show you the population statistics against the total deaths, and then I even calculated the deaths per day, and I think you'd be surprised. I was a little bit as well. So the first chart that I made was just a deaths and total population trend, and I had those two lines together, and we could see that we had a much smaller population back back all the way going on to 1935, all right, going into World War II. We had a slightly higher population, and every year we're rocking about 1.5, 1.6 million deaths, and you can see it go up, and then starting right in the 70s, you can actually start to see a alignment where it's almost exactly in line with it. It doesn't go higher than the total population, right? And then here you can actually see it dips down a little bit, less than expected. The population is growing, but the deaths are not. But then somewhere right around 2009, it caught up really quick, right? And we went right into 2017. And so now if we're looking at the most recent data, we have deaths of about 2.8 million a year. Is pretty normal. And as far as population goes, I think we're running significantly higher than this, but we're looking at 325 million people in 2017. I also took the rate of death. So if we take 1.3 million dying out of 130 million, right, the percentage of people dying was much higher, and then went down, but then it also went back up. Really notable to see. You can see that dip right there from 2009. So that was interesting to look at overall. That number that we're dealing with, that 2.8 million number, it's pretty significant when you're looking at per day. So I went and also checked the life expectancy, right? So life expectancy has continually gone up, but it's not drastic. It might increase by, the slightest percentage is like, a year on your life, like up to the age of 77 over this entire time period. So people are not really living that much longer. There was kind of a steep increase all around like 1940. And then it's really not gone up significantly since then. People are pretty much tapping out in life expectancy in the U.S. anywhere between 61 and really, the mid 70s here. So nothing medieval like it used to be, but yeah. So then we took deaths per 100,000. Now deaths per 100,000 kind of impressed me because it did significantly drop. So we went from about 1,700 people per 100K down to 700. So that's a pretty significant drop. And that did not, it's kind of plateaued out in the past decade and pretty much been about the same. But these are things I'm going to just, when we start talking about daily deaths, you just want to kind of keep in context like how these other additional bigger picture trends have kind of lined up. So here's why I took the data to build the deaths per day, and then I compared that to total population. So if you take deaths per day, I put them in bins. So these sections right here, they kind of show the groupings of the general number, and we see the climb. So back in the 30s, we had 3,640 people dying every day, and it just went up from there. So like when we talk about deadliest days in U.S. history, every day is a deadly day. People die every day. Are people dying of natural or unnatural causes? I think it's important to annotate or just understand that inside this time period, we had World War II, we had Vietnam, Korea, all of the Middle Eastern conflicts, pretty significant amount of stuff going on there, right? So those are all abnormal. And then also we've had, since we're looking at 1930, we're looking at about 90 years, since we're in 2020 right now, about 90 years of data to go off of. And we don't see really abnormal spikes for any specific reason. Like we don't see any apocalyptic like world events. We have had events that have contributed to the death toll, but all of those are just sort of holistically just sort of piled in here. And no matter what happens year by year, we tend to just see kind of a significant uptick as our population goes up. But it's important to note that when we refer to this meme and we refer to these news articles to say, hey, 2,800 people dying in one day is a big deal. Well, since 1930, about 3,600 people have died every day. Nowadays, 2018, a normal number every day was 7,500 people every single day dying in the United States, right? And that's just in line with our population, right? We're having a certain percentage of our population is dying every day. So if that 2,000 number was stacked on top of that already existing, where it's at right now is probably 7,800, 8,000 a day, right? If it was stacked on top of it, making it like 11 or 12,000 per day, that'd be a significant uptick. But if this number is rolled into the 7,000 or 8,000 number, it's extremely normal. That would be considered actually, right on track, and not a significant number. And then when we look at deaths and we consider deadly, the definition of what's deadly, and you rope in all the causes of death. You take all sicknesses. In here, we've got H1N1 and probably a couple of unknown, subtle outbreaks. We got influenza. We got all sorts of different sicknesses killing people all throughout this time. Those are all rolled into the causes of death. And we still see the number rises very steadily on that daily average, right? And if we're looking at it from just a pure people who die every day perspective, then almost none of these death tolls will be notable in terms of the daily toll, right? Now, on 9/11, that was a mass casualty event, and also the Civil War battle, and probably for this hurricane. So those are mass casualty events that they kind of spike. So for those specific days, it's highly possible that the norm was, let's say, 6,000 in 2000 when 9/11, right? And so we're running 6,500 plus that additional 3, so it would have been like 9,000 people died that day, right? So that would have been significant. But when we're roping in these days, also Pearl Harbor, right? That would have been an additional significance. But if we're looking at deadliest days in U.S. history, that's 2,400. We'll roll back to 44, 43, right? So for the time, that would have been an extra 2K on top of that. And that would have made Pearl Harbor, on top of all the natural deaths in the U.S., not even significant by daily standards, and it wouldn't put it in the top 10. So you just have to look at all these, number 4, 5, 6, and 7 on this. When we're looking at like, hey, are these days the most deadly? COVID-19 is rolled into all the other natural causes of death. And I think once we progress after 2020 and we're looking back at the data, and even now when we're looking at the data, I think we can very confidently say that this death toll is basically in line with our population. And these definitely don't break any world records, right? But it's just interesting to know how these statistics line up, and it's just interesting to see. I don't think many of us really think about how many people die in this country every day or how many people die in the world every day, which is a much larger number than this, obviously, because we're looking at way more people. But overall, after I got all of these visualizations together, I went and plugged them into a dashboard. So I just had a collection of different mortality statistics. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not really psyched about the dashboard feature inside of Tableau. And it kind of was a little bit underwhelming, but I'm glad for this that I went with that. But to answer my question fully, I need to isolate a couple of specific days so I can really get to the bottom of, like we discussed with this meme, right? how many days did we have a violent event, a mass casualty event, which spiked over top of the average and made it an exceptional day, right? And like I highlighted, I'm pretty sure that we could take Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and Antietam, which I'm pretty sure is how that's pronounced, and put them aside as probably on top of whatever the daily average was, even though that number accounts for the daily average when we're looking at like millions of deaths. That 3,600, that's not a huge number. It's really gonna throw off. So we can probably take, an average. Oh, also Antietam, something to really think about. That goes all the way back to the Civil War. We're going, years and years before where we even have data to represent. So I don't even know what the U.S. population was like in the Civil War, but I'm going to say that if we look at this trend line, it could have been down to like 80 million or less. Hard to tell. That would be something very interesting to know. But I'm just highlighting that this battle right here and then this death statistic would have been even more significant because 3,600 people would be not considered the deadliest day in terms of just overall mortality, but it might possibly be in terms of mass casualty events that have happened on American soil. So that may be a very exceptional statistic, right? And just something to think about, right? But yeah, so what I'm going to do is go and dig up the data now that actually highlights the highest mass casualty events of Americans who died, who were counted in these statistics, and try to find like the top 10 days. And we'll say we'll get the violent top 10, and then we will get also the more naturally occurring ones. We'll say naturally occurring. We'll include sicknesses in with that, and then try to line that out, and then try to break those out by how exceptional those are. So at this point in time, what I'm going to do is dig through historical records and identify the deadliest days in U.S. history. And I'm going to separate those out into two categories. We're going to have violent days and we're going to have non-violent days. So we're going to say, and when I say violent, I want to be very specific. I'm going to, include things like war or like intentional, fatal situation, terrorist attacks, stuff like that. What I'm not going to include in violence is other natural causes of death. So we'll say accidental car crashes, etc. We'll just say, people die, right? You get buried in an avalanche. It's a violent way to go, but it's natural. It's different than dying from a sickness, but I'm going to take the intentional violent deaths and have them be separate. So I made a schema for this, and I'm going to go ahead and do a fair bit of Googling to identify all these events. But I'm going to get the date, the event, the estimated violent or natural, which one of those it is. It's either going to be violent, that's the value here, or natural, and then the main cause, we'll just identify that, whether that's like pandemic, war, right, whatever the deal is. And we'll put the death estimate, and then we'll say the estimated average without deaths added, right? So we're going to also try to identify, right, what was the average deaths per day at that time period when this happened. And then when we count the excess that happened on that event, we're going to actually decide whether or not this is a more exceptional day or not. So, for instance, back in like 1800, when the U.S. population is a lot smaller, if you had 7,000 people die in one day from a Civil War battle, that's an extremely exceptional day, because back at that time period, with that population, the average deaths per day of just normal routine causes of everything would have been, let's say guesstimate 1,500 per day, right? That would have died. That would make it much more exceptional than today if there was, or let's say 1945, some World War II battle, right? When at that point in time you had 3,000 or 4,000 people die. If 1,000 people died in that battle, that wouldn't make it as exceptional as a Civil War death death count because it's not as high of a percentage over the total normal average of people dying every day. So we're going to try to calculate that out as well. So I'm going to go do a ton of Googling, and I'm going to come back to you with events. So some of the most available data that I had related to death tolls in battles, and since we're talking about U.S. history and we're talking about death toll of U.S. persons, the Civil War was probably one of the biggest instances of that because both sides were in the United States, they're both American persons, right? So this is where a lot of these big death tolls for war come out, whereas in one-sided wars, like let's say, like World War II, right? We're not counting the opposing side's violent death toll in it. So I knew that this would be a start for the death tolls, and I was not disappointed in the data that I found. It was very well structured on Wikipedia, and so I was able to just go in here and find the total death toll, and then I was able to get the date. The one thing that they didn't have is they didn't have it broken out by day. So what the first step that I took is I went through and I've transcribed all of the day amounts, so the deaths per day, with a rough estimate of taking that total battle death toll and then chopping up by days. However, if it was a 4-day battle, we cut it, that total divided by 4. And then I went and dug into some old census records, and I found the estimated total population at the time, or a rough estimate at the time, because I'm going to be real with you, probably 1800s United States data totals are probably not that accurate. So what I did is I went back to the most accurate death rate that I could get from 1934, and I took a guess and said, well, the death rate in 34 probably not that much different going back to 1863, so it could have been a little bit higher, and in some of these years where the war was going on, it was definitely probably a lot higher, but I just use this as a rough estimate to just get the estimated deaths annually out of the total population. At that point in time, there were only like 31 million people in the United States. So some of these battle totals, we're looking at 17,000 people dying a day, 34,000 people dying this day, when the average deaths per day would have been like around 800 to 900 a day. So it's a huge distinct difference in significance of how many lives were lost and how deadly of a day it was. With the cause being war, it's not a natural cause, it's the cause being war. But when we're looking today at, almost 8,000 Americans die every day in our country because of our population size. Now, back then, much smaller number. But then this event is just that much more significant because I'm also calculating the excess deaths for that day. So I'm taking the average, and then I'm sort of I'm subtracting that from whatever the death average was that day. And we're just sort of saying like how many more than usual is that in a day. And these statistics are not going to be spot on accurate because some of these numbers do roll into each other, but at least it gives a somewhat normal visualization of what could have happened. And on this day, because not every day exactly 800 people are dying. That's just a calculated average. And then every month in a year is going to have slightly different figures. So it would be almost impossible to get an exact accurate number on these daily deaths unless we had some sort of curve from every single year that we could look at. We could try to get the date range and then see what that date range average would be across a time set. But we're not going to get that complicated. I'm just going to do these estimates right here. And I'm going to go down and I'm going to roll all these Civil War battles up, and we're going to estimate the day by day count on each of those. Most of those only lasted a day, so that's going to save me a lot of work, and we're going to see what it comes out to. All right, so after a little bit of construction work to get this data set all together, I finally got all of the 1918 Spanish flu second wave, which was the deadliest part of the 1918 Spanish flu, and all of its death counts by average. I did not go through and actually get the, a closer count of per day, but per day was about 2392, and that would have been only, it would have been at a point in time where the population average daily deaths would have been about 2,800 anyways. So we have a natural cause, right? We have a relative significance, right, that I've calculated out of the amount of deaths that will be over the average of negative 429. So the whole point of this data set is to represent just the relative significance, right? So like if we have, during the Civil War, 800 people dying a day, and then one day, 33,000 die, like that's incredibly significant. But then we can say pretty confidently that in 1918, if we had 2,300 people die in a day of a pandemic, right? Normally of natural causes, mostly natural causes, right? 2,800 people would have died anyway. So it makes it a little bit less significant. Not that it devalues anything, but we're just using that as a metric, right? And then I had some other interesting events. I put in a couple of different hurricanes. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake. That one was pretty interesting because 3,000 people died in that at a time when about 2,300 people would have been dying per day. And then actually in September 11th, that was actually an interesting thing there. Although, it's a violent terrorist attack, those people weren't expected to die. But at that point in time, in 2001, 7,800 people were dying per day just because population growth was at the levels that it was. Then we had a couple other things went through D-Day and a couple other additional World War II battles, Pearl Harbor, right? And this is when we start to get into measuring the relative significance against the cause, right? When all these were violent deaths and all these were non-violent, they might get weighed a little bit differently, right? So from here on out, I'm actually going to go ahead and take I'm going to actually find all of the death counts per day for the 2020 COVID pandemic, and I'm going to run those out. And so that's going to be a pretty significant data set, but I'm going to try to find the deadliest days out of that, and then we're going to compare them to now, which is a pretty comprehensive list of the deadliest days in U.S. history. I have, at this point, 214 separate days that represent, chunked out days of significant deadly events in U.S. history. So we're running through everything from war events all the way through to just, the most recent pandemic, we have notes for. A pandemic that I kind of did skip over because the data is really hard to gather is the smallpox pandemic that happened during the Revolutionary War, which is actually the cause of most of the deaths of soldiers that were actually in the Revolutionary War. So there was a pretty significant count on that. But at the time, data collection wasn't exactly as good as we'd like. We have even just pretty iffy estimates on stuff that happened, only about 100 years ago. So back then, we definitely didn't have good enough data that I'm finding to be able to get you like an accurate count or really line up the per day. When deaths happen is really kind of hard to tell. And if it's over the stretch of, a couple of months, not really going to try to break that out. But anyway, this is not a complete list of events, but I'm going to try to make it as complete as possible. I'm going to add in the 2020 COVID pandemic death counts into that as well. All right, so I was thankfully able to find a really good, reliable data source directly from the CDC. I was able to get all of the U.S. deaths and get every single day since the pandemic was recorded. So going back to the very first death that was recorded, that was in February 29th, 2020. And I actually skipped a couple of these in my data set, but I cleaned this all up. And I took it and I ran it against, that's not it, that's my other sheet. Yeah, so I actually took this and ran it all out, and then I took the total population So we're currently working in the United States with 3.28, roughly, maybe a little bit more, but we're gonna run with this kind of in a relative stage. So there's anywhere from 8,900 to 7,700. So give or take about 1,000 people dying every day in the United States now, just because of the population and everything. And so I'm able to now map every single day of the COVID-19 pandemic against all of the other significant events in U.S. history. So this is going to give us now almost 500 deadly days in U.S. history, and we have this this measure of relative significance right here, where we're taking the amount of COVID deaths, which are nonviolent, naturally occurring sickness, right? They're not war related, right? And we're tracking back the difference between the deaths that we had and the normal average, right? So as we creep through these dates, we see that almost every single one of them are in the negative for relativity, right? So even if we had 1,000 people die on any given day, right? So we're looking at August 8th of 2020, we had 1,000 people die. Still on that day, we would have roughly had still about 7,000, give or take. Could have been 6,000 die every day. So that would have been 1/6 ish of the current average that would have been dying happened to be attributed to COVID-19. But if we going back to the root of this whole entire project, and we're actually looking at this, these would be some of the days that would probably highlight on that meme, right? And they say, hey, here's the some of the deadliest days in U.S. history. And we do have some higher death tolls here. We have 3,400, 2,500, 3,000. And when we run these against measures of relativity, we're still not breaking outside of the normal average, especially when we're looking at normal events, right? So if we go look at the Spanish flu, right? And I wish I had the day-by-day data. But you can see even for this, which was considered a pretty significant deal at the time, this almost hit the average, right? We're very close. We're running about, because of the way the data is structured, we don't have perfect numbers, but we're running like 500 under what the normal average of deaths would have been at that time, which would have been about like 2,800 a day. And then if we're looking at current days, we're having a similar count, but we're nowhere near the daily average, right? We're still far off of hitting it. So if we were to compare statistically the 1918 Spanish flu to COVID-19, we would have to have these, if they were going to be relative, these death numbers would look more like 7,000-8,000 per day. They would be making up the bulk of the average that we could expect of the population to die. And I could calculate the variance and difference, right? But the relative significance, right, which would be in these numbers right here, is not the same. But what I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to actually sort by relative significance. And what we're going to do is we're going to estimate. This isn't going to be 100% accurate, right? Well, it'll be accurate based off the data we have, but we're going to try to calculate the deadliest days in U.S. history based off of this overage, right? This F column here. We're actually going to take this and we're going to sort it, and we're going to say whichever one of these is the most in the positive will be the most significant deadliest day in American history. And I'm actually kind of excited to see how this stacks up, because right now we have all of these dates going all the way back to the Civil War, 2 pandemics, right, and about 500 days in U.S. history with at least some sort of ballpark accuracy, depending on how accurate the data is, right? This model is only as good as its data, but right, we're going to try. So let's take sort. let's expand the selection, and we will sort by column F, and we'll say largest to smallest, right? And we're actually now able to see what the deadliest days are in U.S. history. Now, this would encompass both violent and non-violent. Even though dying in a hurricane sounds pretty violent, I marked it as a non-violent death. Still need to know if the categorization of natural disasters fall into violent category. But we can see very clearly here that most of the deadly days in history are due to war, and the vast majority of those, when we're tracking significance or over average, are all from the Civil War, right? With the exception of the Great Galveston Hurricane, which was a natural disaster that smacked about 8,000 people. And on this one, because it was in 1900, very, very sketchy statistics on this. This could have technically been over 1 or 2 days, but the way that the hurricane came in and where it made landfall in one city, with my estimate, I nailed it down to just a single day in which these deaths would have all happened, because the hurricane did come in as a Cat 5 right on Galveston and just sort of hit all at once. So we can, I can pretty confidently say, I can say that it's likely that all those deaths could be attributed to one day, although it could have been like 2. So hard to say a little bit on that because the data collection wasn't that great. But then we can run down even a little bit more, and we can see that we have hurricane in 1899. That was 3,800. We're running through Civil War. We have Civil War, all the way down to Okeechobee hurricane of 1928. That one would be roughly like 4,000 over. And then the 1906 San Francisco hurricane. This is something a lot of people don't know. This is a big deal for San Francisco, and that was 3,000 people. All right, then let's run down here. So we have the 1918 Spanish flu, and that's got a significance of, right, this is very close to the average, so it's not more than we would expect on an average day to die in the U.S., but it is flirting with that. The range is getting to be an overage, right? And I wish I had a day-by-day count, but here we're just running through all the way through all of the Spanish flu dates, it looks like, because they all have the same metric. Okay, and then after that, and I'm down 204 days into America's history, and then we have Pearl Harbor, right? And so that one, it's less than the average number of people we would have expected to die on a day in 1941, which was nearly 4,000. However, those were violent deaths, so we can weigh that as more significant, because had we not been attacked on Pearl Harbor, these deaths wouldn't have happened and they wouldn't have attributed to the total. But this definitely is a deadly day, right? Then we have D-Day, also same situation, and Battle of St. Mayhil. I'm pretty sure I'm not saying that right, but that was a World War I battle, and that lasted 4 days, and every single day we had about 1,100 people die, and the average would have been 28 per day at that point in time, back in 1918. And then we actually land on the deadliest day of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is pretty interesting because this is the one that flirts with the modern average, the heaviest out of the entire COVID-19 pandemic, right? And that was actually April 15th, right? April 15th, 2020, and I believe that this metric is from New York, because in one day, I remember this headline, in one day they dropped like the biggest spike, and you can actually see the biggest spike in reporting of deaths, right? And you can go and you can actually see this on the map, and I think that's right here. Yeah, April 15th, 6,489. This is
a significant variance above any other death toll that's even been reported. So this actually is kind of anomalous to this data set, right? Out of nowhere, there was just a vast attribution, but you don't see anything like it happening anywhere along the curve. So honestly, when you're looking at this data set, you don't see it aligning with the trend. You don't see it. You don't really know why it happened. That's a huge spike on one single day, and maybe it lines with the cases, and we'd have to check with that. And I can go and check out the cases here too. But no, it doesn't even really align with the cases either. So honestly, I wonder if this is a reporting error or something. And that's actually a large chunk of the COVID-19 data, because it's only at it's roughly under 300,000 at this point in time. And so I'd say maybe this one, and this one might be anomalous reporting. These ones all look like they follow the trend, but this one is definitely interesting. So this day, maybe in hindsight, whenever everything comes down, we can actually figure out what's going on with it. We can actually determine what the deal is on that. But that is closer to the average than any day that we've seen. But assuming that that's a reporting error, right? If that was a reporting error, that still wouldn't beat the Battle of Lake Gulf, and that's going to be 3-day battle in World War II, and that was almost 1,000 a day, right? But that's still, when we're looking at significance, right? The violent significance, and also just the relation to the average, right? The relativity here we have closer than that, right? Then we have 9/11, right? So that's a pretty big change right there. So, and that date is not supposed to be 9/1. I think that just got messed up. So September 11th, right? So this one is pretty significant, right? Because the average amount of people that would have died every day, they're rocking around 7,800, and we had almost 3,000 die that day. So that's significant. That event was not expected, right? That's a violent act of terrorism, came out of nowhere, right? And that's a pretty large death toll. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this. So we have right here, this is December 9th, 2020, and this one is from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have that listed over here. This one is, since we're sorting by significance, right, this will still be about 5,000 off of the normal average that we would expect. But we can see that this one does qualify when we're looking at the whole data set, but we're not even close to the average deaths per day, and we're looking at natural deaths, right? And then we still have Hurricane Maria, right? And I'm 217 days into the data set, right? So when we came down here and we hit our first legitimate, I won't say that this one right here, this 6,000 COVID-19 number is completely illegitimate, but I think that we need to look at that and determine whether or not the reporting on this is actually accurate, because it's so anomalous to the data set that stands out, and I think it could raise a lot of questions, right? So we get down here to our first legitimate COVID-19 death toll day, and we are 215 lines into the data, so 215 days into American history before we hit the amount of relevance, right? And then additionally, if we go down to the next highest one, then that would be April 6th, right? We do have honorable mention for December, right? That would be December 11th, and that one is pushing up. But then if we look here at the lower significance, every other day, has less of a significance down here. So when we're looking at American history as a whole, we literally had to go 215 days deep into American history to actually find the COVID-19 pandemic as far as it relates to relative significance in relation to the average number of deaths of people, just all together, right? So that's something to really think about, especially when we're looking at this meme, right? And we're saying, wow, look at how relevant the pandemic is. It's just not accurate to say that it's just not accurate per the conclusion that I reached from this data set to say that last week we had 4 of the deadliest days in U.S. history, because not only, if I sort by date, not only are these December dates, do they not even remotely touch not only do they start to not even break count, right? I'm now 51 days deep into 52, yeah, let's say 52 days deep into American history. And although all of these other counts are war, they're still deadly days, with the exception of a couple natural disasters thrown in here, right? These are all deadlier than any day in any pandemic that we've seen. And these are all mostly attributed to the Civil War, with the exception of 2 natural disasters, right? So definitely we're blowing this meme out of the water here, not just on count, right, but also relevance, right? So, and when we think about death as a whole, right, how does the significance of a pandemic stack against anything else, and how does that total count of deaths lost to attributed to any one event stack up against anything else, right? Because just the other day, the total death toll of the COVID-19 pandemic officially breached the count of American lives lost in World War II. So now the total attribution of COVID-19 significance and total death toll is now over World War II. But when we look at a by-day natural causes of death situation in relation to COVID-19, we do not see, what the deal is, right? So we don't have the total deaths for 2020 yet. And actually, the next project I want to do is I want to see, are we on track for a normal death toll? Like, is COVID-19, did all of these deaths for COVID-19 create excess, or are these rolled into what we would have normally experienced some way or another, deaths like these, right? Because it seems like it's coming on like it's an additional extra thing on top of our normal death toll, but it may not be. So we'll need to grab some data in order to do that. But in terms of relative significance to what we would expect as far as people dying of all causes, we did have to go really deep into U.S. history to actually find where that significance laid for these days in December, where actually that's wild. But anyhow, I'm going to actually run through next step visualization of this data, and then publishing this data and pushing this out. So I took this data set over to Tableau, plugged it in, and I've got a pretty decent visualization for you all right now. And we're going to also look at that meme again. It's been a minute since I brought it out. So let me just line this one out. So we have this meme. We're talking about the deadliest days in U.S. history. It's actually another one I was going to look into as well right there that I showed up. We just have, I stack this right next to it. All right, so deadliest days in American history, right? She started with Galveston, or wherever this meme came from, right? Galveston, Antietam, 9/11, and then all of these other days of COVID-19, then Pearl Harbor, or 9/11, Pearl Harbor, right? So let's actually look at the list as it stands right now. So we have Chickamauga, Antietam. Actually, she had Antietam as 3,600 dead, but it's 22,000 that were actually dead. Chickamauga was actually above that. We look at the Galveston hurricane. That is actually the only stat that is accurate. 9/11 is on there as well, but I believe that we have to dive a little bit deeper to go to actually that one. That's all the way down here. I'm not sure what the rank is of that. But if we're looking at the top 8, we can see that those all come from the Civil War. And then we actually break down and we get into, we actually hit the deadliest day of the COVID-19 pandemic, which if you've been watching along, you've seen that this day might actually be an anomaly the next closest maximum reported day is more around the 3,000 mark, which would put us all the way down here in this area, right? So we got a lot of events in American history that actually stack up before we go all the way down and hit some of these last Thursday, last Wednesday, last Tuesday, and last Friday, which would be over here almost at the hard end right here. Definitely below September 11th, but then also omitting Hurricane Maria, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and a bunch of other things as well. So not to just like aggressively debunk this meme, but I think this is a really interesting project that I've gotten into, and so I'm working on expanding it as well. But this gives a nice visualization of the top events that we can actually look into in U.S. history and see what's going on there with those.
So if you're still watching at this point in time, I want to say thanks for hanging out with me here. I'm going to post all of my visualizations on my Tableau Public, which I'll link below. And also I have my GitHub repository that has the Deadliest Days in U.S. History dataset on here. Definitely go check it out and submit a pull request if you have something that you want to update as far as a statistic or some sort of refinement that you might have on this data set, right? If you have anything, please submit that to me so that I can refine this and make this data a little bit better. Some of this I definitely went with just sort of ballparks on things, although I did, work with a degree of accuracy on these. However, I did have to, at certain points in time, like just dig through Wikipedia articles or like old PDFs from, 1918 to kind of figure out what the stats were and, what the populations were and all that stuff. And then together actually estimate that stuff out. So anyhow, thanks for hanging out with me and have a good one.